This episode was brought to you by Allianz Travel Insurance. You're all packed for the family trip, but your kid catches a bug at school. Our trip cancellation benefits can help. Learn more at AllianzTravelInsurance.com.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies and TV shows you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka.
Dan, I am so excited today.
Mm-hmm. Is it because of the Stanley Kubrick musical?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Did Stanley Kubrick ever try to do a musical? Please tell me that's somewhat real, because holy cow, do I want to talk about a Stanley Kubrick musical now. No, of course, we're talking about Star Wars.
Mm-hmm. I've prepared for this. As you can see, I know that this is an audio medium, but you can see behind me, I have two BBs right there. And then I have the Coke that you can get from Galaxy's Edge. I have a little Grogu
from Batu
right behind me. And I have a shirt that I actually bought specifically for our live show when we talked about The Saga Begins. That says, welcome to Tatooine.
Ah, nice.
Yeah, so I may have seen a Star Wars or two.
Yeah, longtime listeners of anything here know that I am a big Star Wars fan. And I have to say, Dan, I am really enjoying whenever I get to do research for episodes. Usually I'm initially dreading it, and especially this one, I was dreading for a while because this is one of those stories where there's so much conflicting reports and like various fan blogs reporting on rumors, and it was tough to sort through things. But by the time I got to the end of it, I was like, there's some really cool things in this story. When we would do podcasts, I kept dreading any amount of work that I have to put in. And I just loved it when I could just show up. Not that I would just show up. I would put in some work. But I wouldn't do a lot of the pre-research stuff. And I definitely don't do the editing. But I was really happy to do this. And it's good stuff. It's good stuff.
There's definitely some things where you dive into it and you're just like, this is actually pretty interesting once you get into it.
People who have been listening to this season already got a little bit of a tease for this episode when we talked about Star Wars Detours. I mentioned at the end there was a live-action Star Wars show called Underworld, and that is what we're going to be talking about today.
So this is not about vampires and werewolves going against each other. Okay.
Oh my goodness. Could you imagine if it was about Star Wars vampires, though?
I would watch that.
They did do a Clone Wars arc that was like zombies. It was supposed to be this like brain worm that like started infecting clone troopers and spreading around, but like the way the arc was animated and like the way the story was told was very much an homage to zombie movies and zombie stories.
I mean, we already have Jedi ghosts. So we're not too far away from that.
We can absolutely have some Star Wars-y version of a vampire, and that would be super cool. But no, this is, of course, talking more of a different kind of underworld. Dan, how much do you know about Star Wars Underworld? Have you ever heard about this or like the plan to make a live-action show?
I don't know of the plan. I did see the behind-the-scenes look, so I remember watching. It was like part, or if not like the opening scene of the show. I don't really know too much of the context. And then immediately afterwards, I saw how they shot it. And it blew my mind because it's basically just set in this big green room. Not just green screen. It's like this green room. And then you just have the set pieces, like the important set pieces so that actors can walk around them. So that at least they have like a physical space that they're in. But like beyond that is all green. And it looked like that they were doing, it was like a live chroma key on set. So you could actually see kind of what the final product would look like as they were shooting it. And it was incredible how they were able to put that together.
We'll get to that. There's some things about that piece of footage. This is something that arguably is kind of a bigger deal in like Star Wars fandom, especially at this time, than Detours was in that 10 years between Revenge of the Sith and Disney buying Lucasfilm. So, or I guess it would be more like 7 years because I think they bought it in 2012. So for that time, from 2005 to 2012, the idea of a Star Wars live action show was just like constantly just under the surface of like, this is a thing that Lucasfilm is working on, and this is going to be so awesome, and it's going to be so good. You know, also you think about this was right around the time of the beginning of the golden age of television. This is where we got, you know, Sopranos was just ending, but we're getting AMC doing Breaking Bad and Mad Men and The Walking Dead, and we're getting HBO starting Game of Thrones, and so we have big prestige, even genre television, big budget stuff.
We were hitting a time where doing a big budget television show was not out of the question. You could actually put in a large production value. Like we were coming off of a show like Lost as well. Like we're in the middle of Lost. That's a huge production. You mentioned Game of Thrones as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, having these big epic television shows, live action television shows, they could essentially look like a movie. Like you could put them in a theater and you wouldn't tell the difference that it was an actual television show. So it makes sense that Lucas would go in this direction.
Yeah. And it should also be noted, it would be a live action Star Wars show aimed at adults. The idea for this is to be a little bit more adult themed than The Mandalorian is. However, it still wouldn't be like R-rated stuff. The intention was, and I think this is something that we're always going to see as true for Star Wars, is that it is something that kids can watch. I think it will be a long time, if ever, that we see Star Wars that is specifically like only for adults, whether it's too violent or, you know, stuff like that. I would be shocked if we ever see the equivalent of Logan in the Star Wars universe, especially with Disney being in control and everything.
Disney has done more adult work as well. And
That's
I
true.
think we mentioned before that if they actually do go into more heavier subjects, they can throw it over. Like they had Touchstone before if they wanted to go into that. And nowadays they have Hulu. So instead of calling it a Disney movie, they call it a Hulu original. Although it would kind of confuse a lot of people to be like, Hulu original, this Deadpool Star Wars.
Yeah. I mean, I have heard that Disney Fox is now working on Deadpool 3, and it's going to continue to have an R rating for language and everything. So Disney is still going to be willing to do that. But yeah. Before we get more into the story of Underworld, there's a person that I want to talk about a little bit. A person named Rick McCallum. So Rick McCallum is probably the person who arguably has the biggest influence on Lucasfilm through the prequel era and through this era, from the 90s to before the Disney buyout. Probably a larger influence than anybody else except for George Lucas. Rick McCallum is a producer. He was the producer on the prequel films, and he was Lucas's right-hand man. So in the early 90s, Rick McCallum was hired by George Lucas to produce his first foray of live-action television, which was the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles.
We did have the most amazing journeys together.
Golly, sounds great. I'd like to be an archaeologist.
Oh, yes. I remember those.
I have not seen any of them. It was one of those shows that I know gets a lot of credit for its production values and its effects and stuff like that. But I don't really hear it talked about much more beyond that, much more beyond Indiana Jones fandom. Not that it was bad, but I think it just has kind of failed to leave the mark on society that I think they may have wanted to. So McCallum was hired to kind of run the show, and he was responsible for hiring the team of directors and writers who would be creating the production of the show, while George Lucas would stay at home in the editing bay and edit the footage as they come in to put the final pieces together. Mm-hmm. This is the many parts where people like to talk about how George Lucas is an edit bay filmmaker more than anything else. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things about this is that the production was filmed in 35 different countries around the world.
Oh, wow.
If you don't know, that is something still unheard of in television. The only other show that I know of that did something like that was Sense8, which takes place in a bunch of different countries all over the world, and they actually filmed in those countries.
Like Game of Thrones, they were in multiple countries, but they were in multiple countries simultaneously as well to film each episode or film each season.
But a lot of shows fake it. I know Heroes was supposed to be this international show and has stuff in Japan and in America and in different countries all around the world, but everything was still shot within 50 miles of LA.
Knowing Warner Brothers backlots and seeing the backlots of a bunch of other studios as well, they make it look like you can be almost anywhere in the world, and yet you're within like the 3-mile radius of the studio lines. Like if you've ever been on the Universal studio tour as well, they're like, oh, and now we're in Italy. Oh, now we're in Mexico. Oh, and like you can go all over the world just in that small little space.
Yeah. So they filmed in all these different countries around the world. And I couldn't find this specifically, but based off of what I know about McCallum and George Lucas, I would guess that was Rick McCallum's idea to try to go all over the world. When talking about their working relationship, McCallum said, quote, "And directing isn't the main focus of his life. He wants to gather all the material, but he'd really rather just go into the editing room and do that. The best thing about Young Indy is that it was like mail order filmmaking for him. He'd be editing and he'd call me up, and I was always 9 or 10 hours ahead of him and say, I just need a wider shot of when he walks out in Shanghai. But we were in France now. We'd finish in a location and then move straight on. So we did composite filmmaking, where we'd do a hallway in Paris, the stairs in Prague, a ballroom in Moscow, etc."
It seems like if it was pre-planned, that would be insane. But seeing how it actually functions, that makes sense.
They're going all around the world and yet still compositing and faking it, faking different countries for other countries.
That's amazing.
Rick McCallum went on to produce all 3 Star Wars prequels and arguably set a lot of the tone for the way that Lucasfilm would be run for the next 2 decades. This is going to be a little bit of editorializing on my part. Rick McCallum seems to be motivated by like these kind of spectacle accomplishments, being able to say, we filmed this show in 35 different countries. Or when it comes to the prequels, being able to say, we developed all this effects technology. We had the first major motion picture that was filmed entirely on digital cameras.
That means we shot with no film whatsoever. We captured every image with a digital camera that encoded that image digitally. And that really made the process for us, because we're a very special effects laden film, much easier because we have absolutely total control of every frame.
And George Lucas is really excited about the effects as well, but also wants to be more of that edit bay director. And I think for Rick McCallum, being able to produce a George Lucas Star Wars movie is kind of like the biggest credit your career could ever take. And it seems to me like his biggest motivation is making George happy and being able to make him get whatever it is he wants, even if it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of talk about the behind-the-scenes environment of the Star Wars prequels of just like, say yes to anything George asks, don't question George. And I have a strong feeling that Rick McCallum is the biggest contributor to that, in being the person who is always going to say yes to George and figure out how to make it work.
Yeah.
A lot of that figuring out how to make it work was, instead of telling George, oh, we should do this different story thing or this different character thing to make this production more possible. Instead, he would just try to find filmmaking shortcuts and effects shortcuts to be able to make it work. In my opinion, I think a good filmmaker relationship, especially director-producer relationship, is one where the producer does have some amount of say in the story, at least to be able to say, we should do these different things story-wise to make it a easier production to make and a better production to make. And a good producer understands the director's vision to know that those story changes aren't actually going to affect the greater vision in the long run.
I mean, he's putting a lot of trust into George Lucas as is. And
yeah,
there's something about, I think Kevin Smith even talked about it, was like, if you have too many yes men around and no one to really like bring up any, not really conflict, but just to like question, hey, is this really the best, most effective way of doing this? No one seems to be questioning it. And if you're working for him, like as a creative, and then you have a producer who's right behind him saying like, yeah, we're going to do no matter what? And I'm going to make sure that happens. And no one can really speak up because now you have two of the biggest voices in Star Wars to be like, we do this no matter what. And no one's like, hey, should we question some of Jar Jar's motives here?
And you know me, you know that I am a prequel apologist. I think there's a lot of good ideas in those movies, and there's a lot of scenes that I like and a lot of ideas that I like. But again, I think it definitely does succumb to the yes man problem. Like, in my opinion, I think the story that George Lucas was trying to tell was very interesting. He just didn't successfully tell it. If we had a different production culture, he could have successfully told it better, in my opinion.
I imagine that with the original trilogy that he ran into a lot of issues, a lot of producers who telling him no. Yeah. Obviously the big one saying, hey, you're out of the DGA, you can't direct these movies anymore. And he's like, fuck, well, I gotta find some friends that can do this for me.
There's a lot of credit in the original trilogy. Like, I think two of the probably key people who helped rein those in, Gary Kurtz, who was a producer on, I believe, just A New Hope and Empire, and left before Return of the Jedi, who was helped rein in a lot of those ideas. But the other person is Marcia Lucas, George Lucas's wife at the time, and also co-editor. So she did a lot of the editing, but also being married to George Lucas, she's going to be able to have a lot more say in, yes or no. They split up either during Return of the Jedi or after Return of the Jedi, so that probably is a contributing factor as well.
That dynamic reminds me of J.J. Abrams' wife. I forget her name, but she had said that after he did Star Trek, she was like, you got to stop it with the lens flares. People are making fun of you for it. And after that, he's minimized it, and it's almost non-existent in his movies.
That's hilarious. With the success of anything like Star Wars, there have been many attempts to turn it into something that can be viewed on TV. In the 80s, we had two made-for-TV movies, The Battle for Endor.
A family of lost travelers finds shelter and friendship among the Ewoks, peaceful guardians of the forest. But the peace is shattered.
And Caravan of Courage.
And fate leads them to the magical Ewoks.
We help you.
Both of those were projects that the studios wanted to develop into full series. We could have gotten live-action Ewoks TV shows in the 80s, but George Lucas declined.
Were these pitched to him?
Yeah, so they produced movies. I don't know if you've ever seen Battle for Endor or Caravan of Courage. I haven't seen them either. They've got a little bit of a cult following. I think there's a lot of people who really enjoy them, and they're like charming and fun, but they're made for kids and they're cheesy. So I'm not really sure why George Lucas was okay with the TV movies, but didn't want them to be turned into full TV shows. I couldn't find any more details on that. And then the other live-action television foray of Star Wars that we all remember, the famous critical darling, the Star Wars Holiday Special.
Yes.
Our only hope now is to outrun that Imperial garbage scow, though. I'm going to Lightspeed. That's the spirit. You'll be celebrating Life Day before you know it.
It's a tradition every year to watch B. Arthur close down the cantina. I love that she's canon in the Star Wars universe.
To get back to the time of Underworld. So in 2004, a year before Revenge of the Sith came out, rumors started to circulate that after Revenge of the Sith, Star Wars would be heading to the small screen. And there were like a bunch of different rumors that were all totally unsubstantiated that I found. One that I found that I so wish I could find more detail on. It was just like a tiny blurb on a random fan blog. A rumor said that there would be a weekly series starring Mark Hamill and created by Kevin Smith.
I
don't know what that would be, but that sounds great.
That just sounds like, I just imagine Clerks, except it's like just some shop on Tatooine.
Oh my gosh. I'm trying not to do as many of those like unsubstantiated rumors in here, but that was one that was just so wild. Oh God, that would be so good. I want to live in that universe. In 2005, at Star Wars Celebration 3, George Lucas made his first convention appearance since 1987.
Holy shit.
And during this,
Yeah.
Yeah, he was not at conventions or anything.
Like, I'm surprised he wasn't around during any of the prequel stuff.
Yeah, I know part of it is that he's just an introverted guy. He doesn't like being in the public spotlight too often. I think for Revenge of the Sith, this being like the end of the saga, okay, it's finally time to come out and do one of these. But I think also at that point, the culture of Star Wars fandom was shifting. Instead of it being like the mixed reaction to the prequels, it was becoming more of the type of thing where you have the diehard Star Wars fans and people who aren't diehard Star Wars fans are kind of like, I don't know how I feel too much about Star Wars. It turned off a lot of general audiences to the idea. And so I think it was kind of at a time where George Lucas was starting to embrace a different style of fans and audience for his movies.
Yeah.
During his panel to hype up Revenge of the Sith, he also talked about how they were working on 2 TV series. One of them was an animated series called Clone Wars, and the other would be a live-action series. From that panel, he said, quote, "We're also working on a spin-off series with some characters who have appeared before that will be a live-action series, like on Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and want to write all of the stories for the entire first season all at once. I'm going to get it started and hire the showrunners and all of that. Then I'll probably step away." Couple of things there. Number one, I love that he compares it to Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, but also he's doing the thing that he did for Detours, and this is the thing that George Lucas, his approach to TV is, we're going to write all of the episodes ahead of time and then start actually producing them.
Yeah.
And, in this case, wanting to plan out the entire first season, which, gotta be honest, I feel like, I don't know how common of a thing that is now, but I think that's probably a really good idea for TV shows, to plan out an entire season before filming any of it. I would imagine that's more of the case for more prestige shows.
Yeah. I know, like, you look at Westworld, and that's something where the whole season has to be figured out ahead of time. Same thing with Game of Thrones as well.
But there's some of those where they plan out kind of some arcs ahead of time, but they don't actually necessarily write the episodes, full scripts of the episodes before going into production.
Huh. Oh, the first season of Desperate Housewives, the creator of it, he actually wrote the first 5 episodes before it even got picked up. It shows in the actual show itself, because I tried watching a little bit of Desperate Housewives. I watched the first 5 episodes. Those were solid episodes. I liked the arc of it. I liked the mystery that was behind it. And then all of a sudden the 6th episode happened, and I realized like a lot of the storylines went off the rails, because that's where they had to come up with new ideas, new concepts.
You jumped
and
the shark at episode 6.
Yeah. And the writer had a writer's room at that point. So you had a lot of people putting in their input. You have the studio now that's behind it. They're not just liking the script itself, but now they actually have to put in some input for where they want the rest of the season to go.
Also at that panel, he also said, quote, "There's none of the main characters from 1, 2, and 3, or 4, 5, and 6 for that matter, in the..." Well, actually, that's not exactly true now that I think about it. We haven't really started the TV show, so it's hard to answer. There's a lot of issues that are connected, but you won't necessarily see a lot of the people that are connected.
You look at Mandalorian, and it's kind of the same way. It's like none of these are the main characters, but then it starts to bleed in more predominant characters, like we saw in season 2. We saw Luke Skywalker at the end there.
Yeah.
But like we were sprinkled with characters from Clone Wars in the second season.
The thing that I really like about that quote is that he says there's going to be no main characters, and then he immediately walks that back, and then immediately goes, well, you know what? Actually, I don't really know. We're still working on it.
Yeah, he doesn't want to rule that out, because all of a sudden his writers are just like, what the hell did he just say?
Yeah. But like you were saying about The Mandalorian, he is saying, like, we're going to be talking about issues and events that are connected and not necessarily going into the characters that we know. The thing is, though, is that this starts a trend that makes researching this kind of difficult, which is answering the question of what is the show and what is it actually about. You get lots of conflicting reports from different people on what the story was supposed to be. So yeah, as you may remember from our Detours episode, Lucas loves to talk about his projects with a ton of ambition, saying they're going to do a whole lot more than one would expect. Just like Clone Wars and Detours, he was determined to produce entire seasons of the show before finding a network to attach it to. I talked a lot about this in the Detours episode, and then also said at the end of that episode that some of the quotes I mentioned, he was talking about the live action show and not Detours, or not Clone Wars, I mean.
Yeah.
But here's another quote from that same TV Guide interview, which again is just the perfect microcosm of explaining George Lucas at this time. So another quote from that: "No, we'll do it just the same way we are doing the animated series, which is we usually write a whole year first and then we'll start shooting. And then we'll shoot the whole year, and then once we've got something to show, we'll see where we can put it. We're going to do 100 of them too.
Jesus.
It should be easier to place than the animated one because it's live action." He's going to produce 100 episodes beforehand.
100 live action episodes. That's
Yep.
insane.
One of the really interesting things about Lucasfilm in this era is that Lucasfilm was like the largest and most profitable independent studio.
Mhm.
They would only work with Fox for distribution, but it was still Lucasfilm producing, owning all of that, which is a really odd thing to think about. But you know, especially now that it's owned by Disney, but in this time where you had all of these major studios trying their own big franchises, you got Warner Brothers with Harry Potter and Disney with Pirates of the Caribbean and Fox with X-Men and Fantastic Four, and like all these companies trying to do these big franchises. Star Wars is still the biggest and is independent of the studio system.
What I've been finding interesting is that a lot of studios try and replicate Star Wars, or try to, like, it almost becomes like this kind of literal space race of Star Wars had done it first, and they're like, oh, you can make an epic in space. And I've been going through the original 007s, so I'm still like, I think I just finished the Sean Connery years, but then I get into like Moonraker, and I get into You Only Live Twice, and both of those deal with space. And I'm just like, and both of those are a response to Star Wars. And it's like, oh, if you can do stuff in space, like, why aren't we doing that? Why don't we send, you know, this British spy into space? You know, that'll make sense.
Now, you were really shocked at the mention of 100 episodes?
Yes.
Well, at Star Wars Celebration Europe in 2007, Rick McCallum, he's got the ambitions. He said, quote, "We're hoping that it will go on for up to 400 episodes."
Jesus. I don't know any show that's done 400.
As far as hour-long genre television, Supernatural, which ended its 15-year run in November,
it did.
had 327 episodes. So this would have been going on for a couple of seasons longer than Supernatural.
So, okay. I just want to do some quick math here. So, a season, let's be generous about this, say that it's 24 episodes. What year would have this started?
They started writing in 2007, so if all had gone according to plan, let's just say it would be released in 2010.
Okay, so if it was released in 2010, it would go for a little more than 16 seasons if it's 24 episodes, maybe 17 seasons, which means that had it started properly, released properly, it would still be going on to this day and would probably be going on until 2027.
Yep. As I was saying earlier, I think Rick McCallum really likes to have these big, ambitious goalposts that he says, ooh, I was able to help produce this.
Yeah.
In the summer of 2007, this is when they began the process of hiring writers. Unlike Clone Wars and Detours, there wouldn't be a supervising director, and everyone would answer directly to George. Even though he said in that celebration thing, he'll get it started and then step away, it seems like he was more involved in this than he was in Clone Wars and Detours, which he was already pretty involved in. So they sought writers from all over the world, and they were really focusing on writers that were working on other genre shows. Some of the writers that they got were Battlestar Galactica's Ronald D. Moore, Doctor Who's Chris Chibnall, a writer, Tony McNamara, who went on to write The Favorite and the Hulu series The Great.
Oh.
Which, I don't know if you've seen The Great, but that show's
Yeah,
really
I've been
excellent.
hearing a lot of good stuff about him. Yeah.
A couple of other names that you'll hear as we go through: Fiona Series, Steven Skaya, and a whole bunch of others. And so what they would do is they would all meet together, it'd all be flown out to Skywalker Ranch, spend, a few weeks with George, pitch ideas, break stories, and then they'd go off on their own and begin writing drafts. And then every few months, they'd be called back to the ranch to discuss the drafts, get notes from George, get notes from each other, and then go out and do another draft. And doing this process, they ended up writing around 50 completed scripts. More than what George originally intended. They had 2 seasons worth of scripts. Ronald D. Moore, who is probably the person who has talked the most about his experience on this show, he said about it, quote, "George was in the ring with us every day, and it was a fascinating, amazing experience. There was George Lucas, and we'd be arguing about stories, and there was a point where I found myself in an intense argument with George about what Darth Vader would or would not do. And a part of my brain kind of went, what the hell are you doing? Are you really going to argue with George Lucas about what Darth Vader would do?"
No, his lightsaber should be purple.
Yeah. I mean, here's another thing. It sounds like, is this another subconscious yes man environment? Like, it sounds like these writers have more autonomy to provide creative input, but it seems like there's still kind of this idea of George is the end all be all. It's what George says that goes.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the head of his studio. Like, he's literally built this empire, and it was off of his ideas. And yeah, that's a pretty big responsibility to take on.
Yeah.
And ultimately, like, he's approving it not just because he wants that control, but it feels like he is the only person that is allowing anything to be made.
As we can see with some of the problems that Disney Lucasfilm has had, it is tough to run a Star Wars.
Yeah.
So to get into some more details about the story, so this TV show would be set between episodes 3 and 4, the early days and the middle time of the Empire before the rebellion was in full swing. It would have a lot darker and more adult tone. And then from here, this is where details are a little fuzzy, but just trying to piece together the most common things that I found about this, it seemed to be mostly focused on the city planet of Coruscant. You remember which Coruscant was in the movies?
No, I was going to guess that's some kind of bread from France.
That's the big city planet where a lot of action of the prequels take place. That's where the Jedi Temple is. That's where the Senate is.
I see that now.
At the beginning of episode 2, on the hunt for Zam Wessel, they go down into like kind of an underbelly of Coruscant, where they're in that like neon colored bar with the guy who wants to sell them death sticks. That environment was supposed to be kind of the main environment of the show. It was supposed to be about the deeper levels of Coruscant, the seedy underbelly, the crime syndicates.
I'm looking at a few screenshots of Coruscant, and that kind of makes sense because it's a very vibrant, colorful city. It's almost like it's basically the Star Wars equivalent of Tokyo.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it. And George Lucas was initially determined to make this totally separate from the characters we knew from the movie. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, George Lucas said, quote, "It's completely separate. The Clone Wars has a lot of the characters that everybody knows. Everybody from Yoda to Anakin to Mace Windu to Obi-Wan, everybody's there. The live action has nobody there because it's after episode 3, so everybody's dead, basically, or hiding somewhere. You hear about the Emperor, just like you do in episode 4, but it's mostly about a whole different world. I mean, there are a million stories in the big city. You've only seen one of them." I couldn't find the source of this rumor, so this is something from a Star Wars podcast I listened to at the time. They were constantly talking about how the series would be focused on a Weequay janitor. Weequay is the alien species of the skiff guards in Return of the Jedi. This is something that they always brought up as kind of just a running joke of like, oh yeah, that Star Wars show that's going to be all about the Weequay janitor. I couldn't figure out where the origin of that was, whether it was like some interview or if they just invented that whole cloth. But it was kind of the idea that Star Wars fans were expecting. This is going to be about nobody that we know, completely disconnected, even more so than The Mandalorian was. I mean, even in its first season, it's still like, it's a Mandalorian and it's a Baby Yoda. And immediately we know it's connected to the story of some of the bigger things, but it seemed like Underworld would be more disconnected. this is based off of some of the stories that we've heard about this. It seems to be that it wouldn't entirely be disconnected. Whenever writers have talked about it, they're mentioning characters that we know. I mean, we just heard the quote about mentioning Darth Vader. I couldn't really figure out if it could just be because this series was going to be more about the main characters, but it could also be that the writers are only going to talk about the main characters in interviews after the fact instead of talking about no-name characters that people would have no connection to. It also kind of seems like it could have been a quasi-anthology series, kind of like Clone Wars, where it has different arcs that focus on different characters, and like the events do have some interconnected aspects to them, but it would kind of jump around. One quote that I found from writer Steven Skaya, he said, quote, "We told the story of how Han met Chewie and how Lando lost the Millennium Falcon. I even got to pitch a Boba Fett action scene with his rocket pack."
When did he pitch this?
In 2007, 2008 is when he was talking about that. So well
wow.
Before the Solo movie,
Yeah.
where we got both of those stories in the same movie.
Yes. I was like, I've seen this. I've seen this before.
But also, if you're telling the story of how Han met Chewie, you're not exactly staying separate from the main characters.
So what's your name anyway? Chewbacca? Alright, well, you're gonna need a nickname, because I ain't saying that every time.
No, that's still the main characters. Essentially, you're just repeating the prequel trilogy. And it's like, okay, well, we got the origin story of that. I remember there being a rumor of the Jabba the Hutt prequel project. I don't know if it was going to be a TV show or a movie, but I remember hearing about it, and just a lot of the fans are just like, why? We keep on doing this with a lot of the main characters. I don't really care as much.
Now, here's how you make that cool. You know the Book of Boba coming out next year?
I thought you were going to say, lose the. Don't make it the
No.
Star Wars. Make it Star Wars.
So do Book of Boba.
Yeah.
And make it like Godfather 2 style parallel stories where we have Boba Fett building the crime empire, and then we keep flashing back to Jabba the Hutt doing the same thing,
Ooh.
2 generations beforehand.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Another story that was talked about, Moore said in an interview with Inverse, quote, oh, and this is him talking about Darth Vader appearing in the show. Quote, he was going to show up for a big 2-part episode where there was this big uprising happening, and there was a crackdown on things that were happening in Coruscant. Vader shows up and is kind of like, we're going to stop this shit right now. Which, again, not keeping the main characters separate, but also, that sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it's on the same level as Rogue One, Darth Vader going through the hallway and just fucking shit up. And he's like, nope, this is not happening now. If you guys can't stop this, I'm going to do it myself.
Well, I can imagine this being like the arc of an entire season of these groups of people, this criminal element kind of coming together and then starting to kind of work towards something to like trying to destabilize the Empire. I mean, you look at the way that Black Panther would work with different big gangs in different areas and work together towards the common purpose of Black liberation. And like, if you think about this uprising starting to happen, that is, has some of the criminal element to it, but also like the rebellion and this kind of anti-empire element, and then Vader coming in to crack down on that. Which does sound like it would be a pretty cool story. And like, especially that's a great first season building this up. And then the finale, you get this big conflict where Darth Vader just totally shuts it down. And then like, they kind of have to figure out how to rebuild going into the next season.
Yeah, it is.
That could be a pretty cool story. One of the other stories that I heard about this, and this is really strange, and it also comes from a really unlikely source, from game developer Cory Barlog. Cory Barlog was the creative director for the 2016 PlayStation game God of War. But before he was working for God of War, he actually worked for LucasArts, so was in the Lucasfilm game division, and so he was working at the ranch. In an interview about the inspiration for God of War, one of the things he said was, quote, probably the really small beginnings of this idea, the germination of this, is when I was working at Lucas. I was allowed to go up to the ranch and read the scripts for the canceled live-action Star Wars TV show.
Oh.
It was the most mind-blowing thing I'd ever experienced. This is where it gets real weird. I cared about the Emperor. They made the Emperor a sympathetic figure who was wronged by this fucking heartless woman. She's this hardcore gangster, and she just totally destroyed him as a person. I almost cried while reading this.
Wow.
This is the Emperor, the lightning out of his fingers Emperor.
Ironic. He could save others from death, but not himself.
That's something magical.
Wow. I mean, we're starting to see that kind of storytelling nowadays. I mean, in the first Star Wars, we saw Darth Vader, and it just was kind of, there were very basic themes of like, this is evil, this is good. Obviously, we're going to go on the good side. And there is a subreddit called The Empire Did Nothing Wrong. And they're like, they were doing everything correctly. Even Matt Pat of Film Theory, he talked about how the Empire, they were trying to essentially unite the entire universe, which is a very big project to do. That's
just like the Nazis were trying to unite Europe.
Exactly. So Empire did nothing wrong.
Well, it's also kind of wild that like they're gonna tell this love story, like this heartbreaking love story with the Emperor and a gangster. That sounds wild.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would have been good, but man, I want to read that script.
Yes.
Now, one of the other things about this writing process, one of the instructions that the writers were given, which is also super unusual, is that they were told to write like money was no object. Lucas's mandate was, quote, think big, don't have any worries, we'll make it. Budget is no object.
Wow.
We spared no expense.
This is a separate quote, but this is Ronald D. Moore saying, quote, the scripts were written as if money was no object. George was like, don't worry about it. Rick McCallum would groan and put his head in his hands periodically. So for us, it was like, okay, fuck it. Let's write whatever we want. Can you see what might go wrong here?
Yeah.
I mean, you think about, these are all TV writers, so they're not used to thinking about writing with no budget. They're used to thinking about how do we make a big sweeping sci-fi story work on a television show budget? And, you know, how do we do that? And George just keeps telling them, no, don't do that. And so now you have all these writers who have had these constraints all their career, so they were like, just fuck it. Let's just do it. Let's go all out. I think this is also where you see a little bit of a breakdown in the George Lucas, Rick McCallum working relationship. There's a problem starting to arise.
Rick McCallum is kind of the person who has to pick up all the pieces.
And like, he put himself in this position where he'll pick up the pieces and make it work no matter what. But this is a little too far. With 50 hours of television written, you know, they wrote this over the course of about a year. It was time to try to figure out how to produce it. And immediately, their main obstacle was clear: budget. Based on the way it was written, it was estimated that it would cost $50 million per episode.
Jesus. 50?
Yeah.
So, okay. I'm trying to think of like Game of Thrones and the budget for that. Game of Thrones budget, as big and epic as we are aware of, it was nearing the end of their series. They were averaging about $10 million per episode.
Yes.
Which is a lot. And that's mostly going to production. It's not going to the cast.
Absolutely.
Like with the end of Friends or The Big Bang Theory. Those were big budget episodes as well, where like Friends, towards the end of it, I think it was like $7 or $8 million per episode. But part of it was that $6 million was just going to the cast alone. Just that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not really going into the production value, where I imagine the $50 million, the majority is the production.
Yes. And here's the other thing. Remember, Lucasfilm is an independent studio. They do not have big studio dollars behind them. And so they were trying to figure out a way to cut that number, you know, based off of what they had to cut that number down to $5 million per episode.
Jesus. A tenth. A tenth of that. Yep. So a lot of green screen, a lot of CGI.
So in an interview with Collider, McCallum said, quote, "This is the best way to put it into perspective. We did episode 3, which is one of the larger of all the Star Wars films in relation to set construction, visual effects, the amount of visual effects, and everything else. and that was made for $100 million, which was unheard of even 5 years ago. This interview would have been in 2010. So, because had it been made by any studio or anywhere in the United States, it would have easily been double that price. Rick McCallum was good at keeping production costs lower than they needed to be. $100 million is actually pretty small budget for this time for that scale of movie. You know, a lot of movies at this time are of that scale are reaching $150, $200 million budgets. To continue the quote, so imagine an hour's episode with more digital animation and more visual effects and more complicated in terms of set design and costume design than a 2-hour movie that takes us 3 years to make, and we have to do that every week, and we only have $5 million to do it. That's our challenge.
Hey, George, you remember when you said, right, like money's no object? Yeah, fuck you.
Also, he said it was going to be more complex than episode 3, so George Lucas was really like, right, like money's not an option, we're gonna do it.
I'm going over like what are the most expensive movies, budget movies. I mean, there's a lot of Star Wars that's definitely near the top. The strangest thing that I thought was really funny, the most expensive Star Wars movie to be made was Solo. That surprised me.
Because they had to do so many reshoots.
Yeah, because they had to change the director in the middle of it. But that ended up being around $275 million. The most expensive movie to be made was a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Not even like the main three. It was On Stranger Tides. That was $379 million. That is, to this day, still the most expensive movie. I figured it was going to be a Marvel movie for sure, but I mean...
Yeah, like, you know, think about the scale of Endor.
Yeah.
But I think a large part of what causes production costs is production problems.
Yes, because I'm looking at Endgame and Infinity War. Both of them are 3 and 4, but that is not the most expensive Avengers movie. The most expensive one was Age of Ultron. Yeah. And I remember there was some issues with that one. We also saw the same thing in Justice League is just below Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End as one of the most expensive movies. And again, that ran into a lot of issues because Zack Snyder had to suddenly leave.
I mean, how much did they spend just erasing Superman's mustache?
Oh, that's easily $50 million, you know, the cost of one Star Wars episode.
Now, I'm curious with the Snyder Cut. At the time of recording, Snyder Cut is not out yet. I don't know what the budget to make the Snyder Cut was, but do you add that on to the budget of Justice League as one total mega budget for a movie that's not even going into theaters?
I want to say yes. And Justice League is going to be an interesting story, and we are actually going to dive into it in our finale. But so far, that's sitting at $300 million for that.
They did try talking about a few ways to cut down costs. They announced that they'd be shooting the entire series on consumer-grade cameras. McCallum also announced in 2010 that they would be shooting in the Czech Republic because the Czech Republic had massive tax incentives at the time. They were really trying hard to build a film community there.
Well, this is 2010. Consumer cameras are getting so much better.
Yep.
And they were starting to be integrated into actual movies. I remember there was a Terminator movie, the one with Christian Bale. And there was a scene where the helicopter crashes down. It was Christian Bale like trying to like navigate through that. And one of my friends was like, yeah, in order for them to get those running gun shots, they had to use these. At the time, they were using Canon 5D Mark IIIs just to get those shots, just so that they were like in close quarter areas. And yeah, that's a major movie. Like that's put on a big screen. And these are cameras that you can buy at a consumer level. So it doesn't seem unusual now. Was it 28 Days Later? That was shot on a lot of handy cams as well. So like this idea of using a consumer camera was becoming more and more accepted. Even a movie like Crank, even those were done with Canon handy cams as well. And part of it was that they could buy as many as possible. They were like $600 each for these cameras, which compared to an actual film camera, which could be anywhere in like the hundreds of thousands of dollars to use these. And a lot of times these productions are just renting those out. Instead, they could buy like these $600 cameras that they could put on remote control cars and just like they can drive it underneath a real car, or they could like throw it off of a building so they can get these really impossible shots. If they're trying to go running gun, they're trying to get these interesting angles, shots, something that you really can't do with an actual camera. And George Lucas, knowing that he is really embracing new technology, this all lines up perfectly.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Rick McCallum was thinking about those kind of things. George thought that the solution to their problem would be better technology. In an interview with IGN, he said, "I'm not going to compromise on the quality of it. So we just have to keep on working on the technology to see if we can improve ways of getting the story told without it costing a fortune." As you were saying, like, this definitely tracks with George. He has always been the guy who has talked about getting technology to improve his own filmmaking. And this kind of matches a story that has been told about how the prequels were made. Tricky thing with George Lucas is he does a lot of rewriting his own history and saying that, oh, I was always doing it this way, when maybe that wasn't actually the case. But a story that gets told about the prequels is that George Lucas has said that he didn't want to make the prequels right away because he had bigger ideas for the story and wanted to wait for the technology to catch up. And then when it did catch up, that's when he made the movies. Again, not sure how accurate that is, but it matches exactly what he's saying for this TV show. And he really had big dreams of doing for television what ILM's developments in CG did for movies. He said, quote, "We will get there at some point. It's just a very difficult process. Obviously, when we do figure this problem out, it will dramatically affect features because feature films are costing between $250 and $350 million. When we figure this out, they will be able to make a feature film for $50 million. And again, it's so interesting to me that George Lucas thinks of these movies not just as stories he wants to tell, but ways to change the rest of the industry.
Yeah. I mean, we have James Cameron doing the same thing as well when he came out with Avatar in really improving the 3D technology. George Lucas is not the only person who's pushing technology. You have Peter Jackson as well,
Absolutely.
Who's pushing technology in filmmaking. And something that he's done fairly recently is restoring footage. Mm-hmm. It's not just colorizing them. You're actually smoothing things out. You're colorizing it. You're making things cleaner. And I just watched the trailer for the Get Back Beatles, and the footage for it looks like it was shot yesterday. It is so incredibly clear. And that mastering of technology, of taking old footage and making it look modern, is just absolutely incredible. But it's apparent in both of those projects that James Cameron and Peter Jackson couldn't do those stories until that technology was available.
Yeah. At this point, and this is again going to be my speculation and kind of editorializing, but based off of the events of the story, it really seems to me like this is where the Lucas and McCallum relationship ran into an obstacle that could not be solved. Almost a codependent relationship going on. McCallum would always say yes, for better or for worse, but now it was impossible to do that. He couldn't tell George no and change the story to make it something they could film. McCallum helped Lucas make his crazy prequel ideas, for better or for worse, but I think this pairing is kind of the key reason why the show was never able to get made. I really feel like if he had a different producing partner, we would have actually seen it. It would have been different than what they wrote, but we would have actually seen something.
There's also a different mentality when it comes to approaching a movie and a television show budget-wise. If you look at a movie, having that budget goes up, obviously you don't want a movie to be terribly expensive, but when it comes to a Star Wars movie, you know that it's going to make money regardless of what it is. Regardless if it is a backstory of a character that we don't really care about the backstory for, no matter, even if we do get Childish Gambino in it, but you can make that as expensive as possible, and people are going to see it in theaters. You know that it's going to make money. Television shows, that the budget needs to be a little lower. You kind of expect the quality to be a bit less. And having to make a multiple episodes, you're looking at this and you're like, it's $50 million for one episode. And you have ambitiously said, hey, we're going to make 400 of these. 400 $50 million episodes. Let's see.
Is that, what, 20 billion?
$20 billion. $20 $20 billion that you are sinking into a television show.
5 times as much as Lucas sold Lucasfilm for.
Had they even brought the budget down to $5 million an episode, that's still $2 billion that you are spending on a television show, on a very big, ambitious television show. Yep. So yeah, like, I don't blame McCallum at all. Like,
oh yeah.
Like, had he said, hey, you know, I'm okay with the big budget for the pilot episodes because we want to get people interested in the pilot episode, that makes sense. So like, even Lost, their first episode, I forget what the budget is for that, but like, they put in a lot of money, and they even said like, we might not even get the show off the ground. And if it doesn't, like, we might have just like a really interesting hour-long TV special and we can end the story right away. Whereas like, yeah, you could kind of do this with this series and say, hey, we're going to have a really big budget in the beginning, and then we're going to find a way to kind of sustain that and keep the budget down, keep things in like one location. McCallum is basically in this position of like, I've tolerated a lot with you, and this is kind of where it's all gonna stop. Yep. But I imagine, because it sounds like this project is dead in the water, but they filmed something though. I saw something though. And what happened?
So about that footage.
I think I'm being followed.
Initiate search. Proceed with caution.
Get in the back.
Let's go.
In 2020, there was some footage that surfaced online from Stargate Studios that was billed as test footage for Star Wars Underworld.
Oh,
that was
okay.
not supposed to be actual footage in the show, but it was some really unpolished scene. The acting is pretty bad and the script is pretty bad.
Hello. I was sent from Alistair. Thank you.
But the effects are good, and clearly they're just trying to demonstrate what they can do with the effects, and theoretically demonstrate that they could do these effects on a smaller budget. Here's the thing, though. It's absolutely unconfirmed if that footage is legitimate.
Oh.
It could have been test footage that Lucasfilm commissioned to be able to test out some of the technology as they're finding ways to make this cheaper. It could just be some studio trying to get more clout for their name and producing this thing and putting it out there and saying, hey, we did this thing for Lucasfilm, but, you know, just trying to bill themselves as an effects studio to get work that way. It's tricky. Like, Lucasfilm has not said anything about it, and so it could be legitimate, but it's like, with the Detours leak, you know, when that footage leaked,
yeah,
even though there's no confirmation that it's legitimate, we freaking know that it's legitimate because there were shots from it in the trailer. The voice acting is like, that is Weird Al voicing Forlom. That is a much more obvious that it was legit.
And he wouldn't tweet out that leak if it wasn't official.
That footage, it could be legit. I'm kind of 50-50 on it. It does seem like the kind of thing that they would have commissioned in, like, you know, 2010 to try to test out some footage, especially if, like what you were saying, with kind of the live chroma keying, if they could get that working, get it working cheaply, like, that could be a solution, maybe not the solution to their budget problems, but maybe, you know, still wasn't enough. It's a big mystery in the story.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, watching that short, watching whatever scene that was, like, it looked really good. It looked incredible.
Yeah.
So,
and it also does match that tone that you feel, like that seedy, dark Tokyo, the busy streets, and it kind of feels a little like a little criminal elementy, but still with the neon signs and everything around.
Yeah.
Like, it really feels like a Tokyo crime story.
Definitely felt like Blade Runner.
Absolutely.
In a way, which is why I felt like it was legit. It looked really good. The production value was amazing.
Yeah. I mean, if it's not legit, then it's really well done. The scripts sat on the shelf waiting for the technology, but of course, the technology didn't arrive, and in 2012, Disney bought Lucasfilm, and the scripts have remained on the shelf, right next to Detours. The idea of this show was one of the biggest hopes that Star Wars fandom had for the future of Star Wars. It wasn't animated, it wasn't a book or a video game. This was going to be live action Star Wars. This is going to be the big thing that people wanted. It was going to be epic, it was going to be so well made, and it was something that, like, I remember being a fan at this time, and just, this is something that was constantly talked about. If, like, they're still working on this, we're going to see it someday. But of course, you know, the longer it went on without being produced, the more it was like, oh, maybe we won't ever see it someday. And when the Disney buyout happened, that was kind of one of the big hurts that Star Wars fans felt of projects that they wouldn't get to see happen. Probably not the biggest hurt. I think probably the biggest was probably the ending of Clone Wars or the cancellation of the EU, depending on which Star Wars fan you ask. But this was definitely something, and this was definitely something that I remember kind of feeling crushed that we wouldn't get a chance to see this.
Because we had detours, we had Underworld. Have you seen any bleed overs, like, kind of encroach into it? So, like, we had The Mandalorian, which is a TV series that's a lot more adult. We had the Lego Star Wars special, which had a detours type tone to it, where it's made for kids.
Yeah, there's definitely some story elements. Like, obviously, we saw the story of Han and Chewie and the Falcon. And also, you could argue that Palpatine story that they talked about planted the seeds for Rey Palpatine in Rise of Skywalker, you know? That planted these seeds of the idea that Palpatine fucks and could have a grandchild. Which, I personally, not a fan of Rey being a Palpatine.
Mm-hmm.
But if I knew that she was a Palpatine and her grandmother was some sadistic crime lord, maybe I'm a little bit more on board with it.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing, early on, when they were first talking about the TV show, before they even hired writers, there was an effects supervisor on the prequels named John Knoll. And he had this idea that he wanted to pitch to Rick McCallum when he heard, like, oh, they're working on this live-action TV series. It's going to be set place between episodes 3 and 4. So John Knoll came to Rick McCallum with the idea for a heist film about stealing the Death Star plans. But then he realized, oh, this is not actually going to fit in the story that they are going to tell for the show, but that idea stuck around and eventually became Rogue One.
Yes.
Another kind of interesting epilogue to that, Rick McCallum, after the Disney buyout, retired from Lucasfilm and ended up moving to the Czech Republic to start his own production company. So, same place he wanted to film Underworld, he just decided, you know what, I'm just going to move there anyways.
Yeah. Let's see, what has he done?
He has his own production studio there. I tried looking into it. I didn't recognize any of the projects he's done. I think there are a lot of, like, Czech projects, so...
Like, everything before is, like, anything under Lucasfilm, anything George Lucas was a part of, and then you can see that complete separation, that cut to get away from him. And it's weird. It's like the thing that bleeds in is that it says that he's a producer on Star Wars Underworld 2018. I don't know who put that in there. That's definitely wrong and needs to be removed. But yeah, you can see that break, and that's, oh man, that's heartbreaking to be like, this was your whole life, and then all of a sudden your boss went crazy and you're just like, I can't follow him anymore.
One final thing about this story. If Disney hadn't bought Lucasfilm and they kept waiting for the technology, they might have gotten it sooner rather than later. We talked about modern TV budgets. The Mandalorian, which has the scope of a Star Wars movie with all the different planets and the effects and everything, it has a budget of $100 million per season.
Okay.
Which comes to roughly $10 to $12 million per episode. Not quite the $5 million budget they were hoping for, but still, that is a lot more doable than $50 million.
That's more doable, and I mean, with Game of Thrones, we've seen it be done before.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a large part of why it works for The Mandalorian is because of new technology. You were talking about how that footage had live chroma keying. The Mandalorian did something different than green screen. Do you know about this?
Yeah, because they use the same technology that they use for the Tom Cruise movie Oblivion. They were using not just green screen, but they were using like this wraparound screen that would create the environment that they were in on location.
Anybody listening to this, if you haven't seen behind the scenes pictures of The Mandalorian, definitely go look it up because it is fascinating. It's this massive 360 LED screen that wraps around the actors, and they generate the environments in the game design program Unreal. They generate these environments to be in the background so that way they can film without green screen. I think there's a little bit of cleanup in post. There's a lot of really impressive technology in there. You know, another thing they have to do is for camera moves, have the environment kind of match that motion to keep it looking realistic. It's really, really fascinating. And that kind of technology could have been the thing that Lucasfilm needed to make this TV show.
The Mandalorian budget I was looking into, they average on each episode $15 million per episode.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, they're not going to go for the ambitious 400 episode series, but they are. And what's interesting, and I guess kind of what Lucas was going for, was that there was one day where Disney just exploded in announcements of like, here's all of our new projects. And like 10 of them were new Star Wars and none of them were movies.
Yeah.
They were all television shows that you are going to get on Disney Plus.
Well, they'd announced at least one movie. I know they got Rogue Squadron.
Directed
by Patty Jenkins.
Yeah, but like the majority of content that's being done Star Wars wise is predominantly television, and predominantly television that's just going on their streaming service.
With Mandalorian costing that much per episode, they also have a lot of big name actors in that show. Like, could that budget actually reach that $5 million goal if they had gone with unknowns, if they didn't have the A-list director talent that The Mandalorian has, you know? Who knows? It's interesting to think about it. I definitely don't think we're going to see Star Wars Underworld. I think it is a darker tone than Disney wants to do with Star Wars. I do imagine, though, the scripts still are on the shelves, and there's probably ideas from those scripts that maybe we've already seen, you know, leak into Star Wars storytelling that we see in the future. I really, really would love, though, I would love for them to just publish written versions of the scripts just so I can read it. The stories that they say about it, it sounds so interesting and wild, and it's the type of thing that could be really good or could be really bad. But either way, George Lucas does not make boring products.
No.
There might be some listeners who would want this to be an entire episode, and maybe there is enough of a story to make this an entire episode. If we would be willing to expand our purview as well to video games that didn't get made. Because at the same time, LucasArts was developing a video game called Star Wars 1313, which was supposed to take place entirely in the underbelly of Coruscant and be focused on the criminal element of Coruscant. And I believe like part of the game was supposed to be like young Boba Fett and getting up there in the crime world and stuff. And there was a lot of talk of that having some tie-in with the live-action show. In fact, it also ties into Clone Wars, one of the episode arcs that was in the last season of Clone Wars, so something they were working on, and then the show got canceled, but then they finished for the final season on Disney+. One of the arcs takes place in Coruscant level 1313, where that game is supposed to take place. There was even like a trailer and test stuff, but that was another thing that was axed with the Disney buyout.
Wow. We'll look into that, and if there's a full story behind it,
And if you really want to see us try to talk about that, or maybe even other video games that didn't get made, that could be a whole other interesting thing. Send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com.
We'll do it. I like that idea.
If we do video games as well, I could do a whole thing on canceled Zelda projects.
Ooh.
We'll save that for season 3.
Yes, we will. We'll call that section, How Did That Not Get Played?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, well, that is Star Wars Underworld.
All right.
Well, I guess that's going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening.
Yeah.
You can find more of this podcast by going to our website, pipedreampodcasts.com. You can also find Come On Fahuquapods, Escape from Vault Disney, and more. You can send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com, especially send in any ideas that you have. We've got a couple of those ideas in this season. If you know of a story that we should talk about, let us know. You could even include video games, maybe, if there's some good, interesting stories there. If you want to find us on social media, we are on Instagram at HDTNGM. Nope. We are on Instagram at NotGetMade. We are on Twitter. What?
How did this not get made?
Okay. We are on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made. We are on Twitter at HDTNGM. You can also find our Patreon page. Link is on our website, where if you donate $2 a month, you get a special monthly bonus show. And for $5 a month, you get access to our notes. And we really, really appreciate everybody who is helping keep this show and the rest of our shows going. Well, that's going to be wrapping us up today. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening.
Thank you.
And I hope you find somebody who loves you as much as Rick McCallum loves George Lucas.
I want someone to look at me how Rick McCallum looks at George Lucas.
Just one more round, friend, then homeward bound, friend. Don't forget me in your dreams.